said this is a little bit more personal. So I'm speaking here as a historian trying to think historically about the events that are happening. I'm saying that also as um, uh, just so you know that I'm speaking here less as a historian and more as somebody who thinks history, but not politics. I'm not getting into politics and geopolitics so much, only as much as it relates to historical thinking, which is part of how I'm looking at these things. So I'd like to begin with obviously, I think it's important to mention our three hostages that were brought back at the beginning of this deal. So Romy, Emily, and Doron. And this is it's important to understand because there's different ways that this news reaches the rest of the world, and sometimes the message is lost in translation. In Israel, I don't believe there is anybody who is unhappy with their release. There's no debate about that. But there is a fierce argument in Israel about how they were released. What is the method of releasing the rest of the hostages? That's really a very, very strong debate that's felt today in Israeli society, and people from all sides of the aisle are being criticized because of what they say and being misunderstood. And so, just as an example, one of the people who were against the deal was Bezalel Smotrich, and yet when they were released, he posted on his Twitter, on his X, that he was very happy about it, and people attacked him because he was against the deal. And he said, "I'm not against. Everybody wants them to come home. The question is, what's the method in which to achieve it? Do you continue with military pressure like we did in the beginning and we were able to release 100 hostages? Or do we have the involvement of other countries putting pressure on us and letting Hamas rebuild their power through humanitarian aid?" So that's the debate that's happening in Israel, but there's no debate about wanting to have everybody released and wanting them home. So it's important to mention that to start off. Now, I'd like to focus on the main part of this presentation is going to be about, I guess, the big picture. I'm calling this East and West to understand what we mean when we're talking about the East and the West in the current situation, which trickles all the way down to the to what we call the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But I want to look at it from a historic perspective so that we can appreciate the forces at play. So this is a topic which could easily be a PhD. So I'm giving it a very distilled version, but at least I hope to cover some of the main points so you can revisit them. I'm sure you're going to be familiar with a lot or most of them, if not all of them, but to put them together and to see how they help us think about the current situation. And then in the end, I'm going to talk about the north of Israel. My brother, one of my two brothers, is actually the deputy mayor of the Golan Heights. So I had a conversation with him to understand what's going on in the north. And he actually sent me some pictures from the Syrian border where he's there in the tanks division. So I'll be sharing a little bit of that at the end. And also a very hot topic in Israeli society, which really needs its insider's view. And not what you usually get in the news on the other side, is what's happening with the military conscription of the ultra Orthodox, which is a very, very hot topic here in Israel. And I'd like to reflect on that, and I guess through that to talk a little bit about Israeli society as well. So let's begin with East and West. What exactly do we mean when we say East and West? So, first of all, I'd like to define the East a little bit. When I say the East, this part of the world is called the Middle East. But the reason it's called the Middle East is really an echo of colonialism, which is, of course, today is a very hot topic. But to really understand what is going on in the Middle East, we really need to understand the impact of the different colonialist powers, the powers of the United Kingdom and France, and there's Russia and Italy, and there's a lot going on there. And I'm going to touch on some of the main points. So we have to go into that. That's the West. But what is the East? So when we talk about the East, which is both the Arab world and really deep, in a more deep sense, the Jewish world, except that we're a bit of a mix, as we'll see, because we've been through so much history. When we think about the East, we usually think about Arabia. We think about Arab culture. We think about Bedouins, nomads, the desert, tribal society, which has a lot of values that come with it. This is very important because the Eastern values that are dominant in this area are very strongly based on desert culture and tribal culture. And this is something that Jews share with Arabs. So it's important to understand these roots. So when we talk about tribes, we talk about the desert. Um, think about the idea of honor. Honor is a very important thing. There is defending your tribe, which is very important. And there is also fighting over resources. So in the desert, every tribe has their own area, their territory that they have to defend. And there are certain rules of the desert that have to be understood if you really want to understand the Arab world. And we're going to unpack that a little bit. There's also the value of honoring the elderly. So the elder of the tribe, the parents, the grandparents, they stay in the house and they're in the center of attention, as opposed to the way the criticism on the West is you send your elderly parents to an old age home. That's unthinkable in the Arab world, right? In the Eastern world. It's a lot about traditional values and hospitality, which has a lot to do with the laws of the desert. So, for example, in Bedouin culture, this is something that they still talk about today. I believe that when we went with the Bnei Mitzvah program, the Bedouins spoke to us a lot about this. I've been there on this trip twice. So once it was a Bedouin, once it was a woman, a very amazing person. If you've been on that trip, you know what I'm talking about. The Bedouins have rules where if you go up to a Bedouin tent in the desert, they are required by law to give you the best hospitality for 3 days. They have to even slaughter an animal a day to feed you. I mean, this is serious expenses, bed and breakfast, and they send you on your way. Now, of course, today that's being eroded because you just have a car. It's not the desert. You're not traveling on camel for days on end in the desert. So it's slightly changing, but this is what it's based on. It's understanding the desert and protecting travelers. So you have that kind of guarantee that you're going to be protected and they will protect you, you will protect them. So these are laws of the desert. So hospitality, for example, is a very big one. Now I'd like to show how this is connected to our ancient roots. Our biblical roots, our ancient roots are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Abraham comes from Iraq or Kuwait. He comes from the Persian Gulf. So Abraham, if you read the biblical story, he's kind of a Bedouin. I mean, he's traveling with sheep. He's basically an owner of shepherds. He doesn't have a physical estate. He's always moving, following the rain, traveling. And we have, of course, Jewish stories. Some of them are more like they're traditional stories. They're not in the text, but they talk about Abraham and Sarah's tent. And there's actually a book by Bruce Feiler who wrote several books about this topic, In the Tent of Ishmael and Abraham. So exploring the biblical stories with a keen eye on Bedouin culture will help us understand a lot of the biblical stories and our roots. So this is another detail. Now, I'd like to take that a little bit further and talk about tribes, not tribalism in the negative sense, but tribes in Jewish history. So in Jewish history, we have the 12 sons of Jacob, who are known as the 12 tribes. And each one of them ends up having a different portion in the land. This is a map based on the book of Joshua, which is the book in which we, after 40 years in the desert, we enter the land of Canaan and conquer it and start settling it. And these are the portions that are allotted to the different 12 tribes. If you have a keen eye on this, you'll notice that there's no tribe of Levi That's because the Levites or the priests are basically public servants who don't have the merit of living on the land. They're all over the place, spread out in many different places, and they're there as public servants. So when you're a public servant, you don't have the rights of a regular tribe, and you also have to be supported by the rest of the tribes. And that's why we have things like different tithes, different percentage of people's produce that's given to the priesthood during temple times. That's partially why, because the priests and the Levites do not have inheritance, they don't have fields, they have to be supported. So this is 12 tribes. Now, when we come to the later history, which is the Iron Age, when we have a kingdom, the first king of Israel is King Saul, and he's of the tribe of Benjamin. And if you travel north of Jerusalem toward Pisgat Ze'ev, you go north, you will have a big sign with the symbol of a wolf, which says, "Welcome to the Benjamin Regional Council, Mate Binyamin." And it quotes here the verse from the blessing of Jacob to his son Benjamin, you are a predator like the wolf. So he's called the wolf. The second king of Israel is of the tribe of Judah, and that is King David. And he founds what's called the Davidic dynasty. So his son is King Solomon, and then his son is Rehoboam. After that, we have a split into two kingdoms, which is a different topic than today's topic. But the point is that we have tribes deep in our roots. And after the Assyrians deported, exiled the kingdom of Israel in the 7th century BCE, so we have the kingdom of Judah remaining for another 140 years. They were exiled by the Babylonians. And that is why we are called Jews, because of the kingdom of Judah, not because of the tribe of Judah. So you could say, like, for example, my original family name was Cohen. We adopted the name Selavan to escape the Russian draft. My great-great-grandfather came to Israel in the right after World War I, in the third Aliyah, and Hebraicized the name to Selavan. But the original name was Cohen. Cohen is from the tribe of Levi, and yet we call ourselves Jews. So the tribal association has become blurred, especially after the destruction of the first temple by Babylon, and of course the second temple by Rome. So at the end of the day, we have a different kind of Jewish identity today, and we've sort of forgotten that we were very tribal in our nature. But when you read the stories in the Bible, the story of the judges, you see that the judges are basically Jewish leaders from different tribes, and sometimes tribes help each other, sometimes they ignore each other, sometimes they fight each other. So that's a very big part of our history. And we'll see how that relates a little bit today. I do want to mention that the 12 tribes are still a very known theme. Many synagogues have some reference to the 12 tribes. Either it's in stained glass windows or on the Torah Ark. So the 12 tribes are very well known. And this is a series of stamps from Israel that shows the symbols of the 12 tribes with a verse in Hebrew and the name in English. So, I mean, these are very old. These are from the 1960s, I believe. So that's a little bit about the 12 tribes. Okay. So now that we've covered the basic idea of tribes, I'd like to get a little bit more into Islam. And then we'll talk about the bigger picture. So Islam is a very interesting religion. We have to separate between Arabs and Islam. Islam is the religion, Arab is an ethnicity, and today the Islamic world is broader than the Arab world. So it's important to differentiate between the two because, for example, Turkey and Iran are not Arabs. They are Muslim, but they're not Arabs. So it's important to make that distinction. But the religion of Islam in its essence is the Arab desert culture. And it's important to understand that. So the idea of hospitality, honoring the elders, all of these things are part of the Eastern culture of Islam. So in terms of Islam and its relationship to Well, first of all, to Israel, we have to break up the Muslim world into its two main constituents. There's, of course, a lot of subcategories, but it's important to understand that because that will help us understand the geopolitical map a little bit more. And then we'll talk about East and West. So the main two branches of Islam are Shia and Sunni. So the Shiites and the Sunnis. What exactly is this? So the founder of Islam, Muhammad, dies. It's the year 652, and after he dies, there is a debate because he never really decided who is going to be his heir. There's a debate within the following of Muhammad who will be the heirs, who will continue to lead. And this is, of course, a very tribal kind of argument, and it is settled in very tribal ways, which means it's going to be very bloody. So the Shiites say that it should be the family of Muhammad who takes the lead. That would be Ali ibn Abi Talib, who is a cousin and son-in-law of Muhammad. So he's the bloodline related to Muhammad. Now, the Sunnis say, no, this should be decided by the Council of Elders, and it has to do with the leader who we're going to call a caliph. So we've heard the word caliphate, like a kingdom of Islam. So it's supposed to be the caliphs. Now, the caliphs, the Sunnis, were the much more powerful. They're the much more powerful of the two. And so they end up having internal fights, and basically Ali is murdered, and after his descendants try to continue, they're massacred as well. And at this point, the Shiites break away from the main Islamic world, and that's the Shiites. And until today, this is a 1,500-year-old war. They are at war with each other, and that helps understand the bigger geopolitical picture from within the Muslim world. So I'll show this on the map, and I'll try to explain it in terms of some real examples of what's happening in terms of Hezbollah and Hamas and the Abraham Accords. Right, this is very important to understand. So the Shiites are the minority in the Muslim world. We're talking about 11 to 12%, maybe 15%. They're the largest minority. They're by large the minority, and they are always persecuted. And then we have the Sunnis. And we'll see that the Sunnis are divided into two subgroups geopolitically, which is really important. So let's put this on the map for a moment. There's many different maps that you can find. I just found one that has contrast in color that's easier to see. So the dark blues and greens, those are the Sunni, which you can see are, most of North Africa and Asia and Arabia are Sunni. There's a few spots of yellow to red, that's Shia. So the Shiites are a minority. So who are the leaders in the different directions of the current geopolitical situation? This is going to help us understand. We have Iran. Iran are Shiites. They're the Shiites, and they are supporting the Shiite militias like Hezbollah and the Houthis and different Iraqi militias. So Iran is one world power today, which is Shiite. So as far as they're concerned, they're trying to basically avenge the blood of Ali in a sense. There's like a tribal blood feud, and they have a vendetta against the rest of the Arab world. And the Arab world understands this. This is internally known. So who's on the other side? The Sunnis divide into two different subgroups. We have the moderate Sunni, and that is, for example, Saudi Arabia, where all the main Muslim buildings are. We have the Qibla stone, Mecca, Medina, that's Saudi Arabia. The United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Egypt, and a few other ones. So those are the countries that are more related to, let's say, the Abraham Accords. They're more close to us. Egypt, for example, until recently was a pretty safe place for Israelis to visit, right? And we'll talk a little bit about Egypt soon. Then we have the more radical Sunni, and that's the Muslim Brotherhood, which took over in Egypt. So that's related to Hamas. And then, which is, it's a really interesting thing that Iran is funding Hamas because because they're more related to the Sunnis. So there's really interesting interplays here, but sometimes you can say that they band around the flag of Israel as the big devil that we have to get rid of, so they unite, even though the Iranians look down on Hezbollah. They look at them as like cannon fodder, but we'll use them against Israel, which is the big devil, as they call us. So it's important to understand, like, they despise Hamas, but they will fund them as a proxy, right? And then, of course, we have Turkey and Turkey and Tunisia and Qatar. So those are the radical Sunni Muslim countries that are all funding all this terror and are a lot more difficult to deal with. So, for example, Turkey was involved in the downfall of the Assad regime, which was a lot more moderate or related to the Shiites. So, and there's a mess going on inside Iraq, but we didn't get to the point where we can unpack that yet. So this is an overview, Shia and Sunni. And as I mentioned, the most important religious sites for the Shiite Islam are in Mecca, Medina. Like, these are the more sorry, not Shiite. The most important religious sites for Islam are in the moderate Sunni parts of the Islamic world. That's a very important detail. Within Islam, there are arguments about the importance of Jerusalem. Believe it or not, where actually the more moderate Sunnis will say that Jerusalem is not as religiously important to Islam as you would think, but that was created to sort of rival Mecca. So there's also that argument within the Muslim world that also enables them to be a little more moderate towards Israel, because we're not really controlling their religious important sites. Those are in Mecca and Medina. So that's another important detail. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the relationship to Israel, just one important religious point, and then we'll move on to the concept of East and West. So in terms of Islam, what is the issue with Israel? This is complicated, and the next point, which has to do with East and West, is going to expand on this more. But from a religious perspective, Islam is a young religion. We have Judaism, the oldest monotheistic religion. Then we have Christianity, and then we have Islam. And in a sense, the fact that the Muslim world, by and large, is in shambles creates a kind of inferiority complex where they feel like they need to finally have a success. Look, we're supposed to be the final word of God, and yet look at our country, right? So what are they doing wrong? And yet Israel is successful and prosperous. So in a sense, that's kind of in their face, because according to Islamic religion, at least according to some interpretations of it, Jews are protected by Muslim law as what's called the people of the book. I'm sure you've heard that expression, but that comes from the Quran. And it says that Jews are not considered infidels because they are people of the book. However, because they are not Muslim, they are required to pay this jizya tax, and they are considered dhimmi or dhimma, which means a second-class citizen that's protected by Islam. If the radical Muslims had their way, the way to achieve, let's say, so to speak, peace with Israel is if Israel as a sovereign state would cease to exist. The Jews can stay in their place, but they have to accept being second-class citizens who pay a humiliating tax to the Muslims. So not everybody accepts that today. That's how we're able to have the Abraham Accords and conversations about peace. But this is at the heart of a lot of the hatred against Israel, it has to do with the religious sentiment of we're supposed to be superior. How are they successful and we are not? And of course, this is what I've understood from hearing different historians about it. I could be wrong, but it seems to make sense. Now, let's get into the bigger picture, East and West. The truth is that to really understand what is happening in the Arab world at large, we have to go to the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The Sykes-Picot Agreement is perhaps the most important event that will define the next 100 years and where we are standing today. So the Sykes-Picot Agreement is, of course, a secret agreement that was made between the foreign ministers of England and France during the World War I, in the beginning of World War I, before it was even won. This was, of course, done with Russian approval, and the idea was, and also the Italians were involved, and the idea was basically, let's divide between us the Ottoman Empire, which is clearly going to fall. And this was done in a very sneaky way. And of course, there's a lot of debate about its legal veracity. And this agreement didn't fully happen. It was discussed and debated over the next several years. And it wasn't until the 1920s and 30s where a variation of it was carried out. But the important point about this is that it is Western colonial forces who are deciding, as we say, basically drawing on a napkin, deciding how to carve up the Arab world. That's the most important point. So here's one of the pictures that describe how it's going to be carved up. And of course, this isn't exactly what happened. But the point is, there is no regard here to the Arab and Muslim tribes and identities such as the Kurds and so on. This is basically a carving up of the map based on interests of the various empires. I'm just going to show another example. I just have one map here in Hebrew, one in English, but these are color codes for the different parts of the Middle East that are going to be carved up. So you have parts that are a combination of Britain, France, and Russia, parts that was supposed to be Arab countries, the Hashemite kingdom, underneath Britain, then you have underneath France, and then you have French rule in Lebanon, and there's a lot of interesting things going on here, and it took a while until the dust settled. But the real important point here is to understand that is just another example. This wasn't even the final map as well. The Paris Peace Conference, more was going on. But what's important to understand is this. Western colonial forces carved up the Middle East based on their interest. And they had very little regard for what are the interests or needs or sensitivities of the East, which is very much about tribes and about the Shi'ite-Sunni division as well. So sometimes they would draw a line around a country and say, we now dub the Iraq. Not the historic Iraq, but rather the modern country Iraq. We're going to put a flag onto you, and you will now be loyal to this new European identity. Forget your tribal connections. As we see today, that doesn't work. You can't impose a Western country nationality onto Eastern tribal ethnicities. It doesn't work. It's completely ignorant. And that's what failed. The main thing that failed. There's a lot of things that failed here as well. For example, in the Sykes-Picot Agreement, we also have the British promising Israel, Jordan, Palestine to the French, to the Arabs, and to the Jews. So we have the King Hussein, who ended up founding the Kingdom of Jordan. He was really the ruler of Mecca. And in order to get the Arabs to join the war, the Arab revolt, to join the British, this is the story of Lawrence of Arabia, to basically join the British against the Ottoman Empire, the British promised them all kinds of grand things. But they also promised it to the French, and they also promised it to the Jews. That's the Balfour Declaration. So this was not really simple to solve, and this was also used by all sides to basically say like, okay, this doesn't work, it's not valid. And then we have the British Mandate of Palestine. A lot of things ensued after this, but the most important point to take from here is that if you want to get to the root of the conflict between East and West, you have to go back to the Sykes-Picot Agreement. This is where it all begins. Um, for now, I want to give you an example of which Arab countries work and which Arab countries don't work from this perspective. And then we'll get on to a few more important topics in the Arab reaction to the West. So if you want to make a pretty fine line between the Arab countries that are in conflict today, Syria, Iran, Iraq, Yemen, and those which succeed, like the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, you can say Saudi Arabia, it's all about tribes. Who is in charge of the government? In the Arab countries that work, it's all one tribe. So Ibn Salman, we have Saudi Arabia, right? The Arab world, the countries that are successful are governed by one tribe. So they have this internal respect, they have common interests, and they have prosperity. The Arab countries that are at conflict are countries which were surrounded by an imaginary line by colonial forces, and they don't really have one leadership. There's a conglomerate of different conflicting ethnicities: Sunni, Shi'i, Kurds, Christians, Muslims, Alawites, all kinds of different. It's a mess. If you go to Yemen, just about every prominent hilltop is a different tribe. They're all territorial, they're all fighting with each other. So this helps us understand the Arab world. We need to understand the Eastern way of thinking, and that will help us come up with solutions. So one last thing about this, if you want to talk about the normalization of the relationship between the Arabs and Israel, whether you call the Israeli Arabs, Palestinian Arabs, there's different groups, and Israel. One of the very interesting suggestions by Professor Mordechai Kedar of Bar-Ilan University is called the Emirates Plan. It's worth looking into, where he basically says, let's identify the heads of the different Arab clans in Israel, and we know who they are. And instead of letting the Oslo Accords, which put this corrupt organization, the PA, the Palestinian Authority, which is a kind of Western democracy, at least that's what it's intended to be, and to superimpose that onto all these different Arab tribes, that steals the honor of the elders of the different tribes, who are now powerless because of this corrupt PA, the Palestinian Authority. Let's revoke that, restore the honor of these different tribal leaders. For example, this family in Hebron, this family in the Galilee, and then give them a certain kind of internal autonomy, but make sure that they're broken up in such a way that they're not threatening Israeli security. And then they will have in their interest to maintain peace. So this is a serious conversation that's actually being had on the grassroots level with Arab leaders. It's happening right now. It's called the Emirates Program, not to be confused with the United Arab Emirates. Okay? All right. I had another thought, but I think I'll leave that for later. So now I'd like to talk about a few reactions in the Arab world to the West. So the Arab revolt is talking about the Arabs who joined the British against the Ottoman Empire. They were promised great things, and those promises weren't entirely kept. But what's interesting is the flag of the Arab revolt. This flag was actually designed by Sykes, the same Sykes from Sykes-Picot, Mark Sykes, the foreign minister of Britain. Every single Muslim flag today, or almost every single one, is a variation on this theme. All the Arab flags, it's hard to even tell the difference. This is not the Palestinian flag, this is not the Jordanian flag, this is not, right? But they're all variations on this. So there's been a very powerful impact of the Western world on the Arab world. In fact, I was just in Eilat a couple of weeks ago, and we took a boat all the way around to the port of Aqaba and then Saudi Arabia. It's a glass belly, it's a glass bottom boat. It's a great ride. If you go to Eilat, I'm happy to recommend it. I forgot what it's called right now, but we got to see the port of Aqaba, and the flag that's hanging up from the port of Aqaba in Jordan is the flag of the Arab revolt, not the Jordanian flag. So this tells you a little bit about where they are holding. They're a little bit more leaning towards Western, right? Because this is a British flag, basically. Now, a reaction to this is something that's called Pan-Arabism. It's also called Nasserism. It's got a lot of different names, but Pan-Arabism is a very interesting phenomena which was first implemented as a real political movement by the leader of the Egyptian revolt in 1952 against the original rulers of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was succeeded then by Sadat, who made the peace accords with Israel. Anwar Sadat, who was then assassinated for that. So this leadership of Egypt lasted until the Arab Spring, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, fairly recently. Pan-Arabism is a pushback at Western influence in the Arab world, and interestingly enough, it's a socialist and even communist leading movement, basically saying let's stick together and push back at the West. This is quite an amazing thing. So the history of the Arab world and communism and socialism, it's a really fascinating topic, and it succeeded for a while in different areas. It was a secular Arabic movement, which is kind of what was happening in a different sense with the Shah in Iran or with Ataturk in Turkey. It's trying to take Islam as a kind of to secularize it, to make it like a state religion, but not a binding one. It's like Christianity in America. It's like it's cute, it's the Christmas tree, but it's not the Christianity of the Crusaders, right? It's much more, much more tamed. So they tried to do this. Every single time an Arab leader tried to create a secular, socialist, kind of pan-Arabic government, it failed. It's always pushed back at by radical Islam. Time and time again, they keep on trying. Now, this is, of course, a very, very broad topic. This is the flag of the Pan-Arabism. It's a flag made by Nasser. So this is the emblem of Nasserism, as it's called, named after Nasser. These things did not succeed. They tried. We also had the Assad regime was sort of trying to do that. He wasn't a traditional Muslim. He was an Alawite. It's a whole different story. But he came from England. He was a dentist from England. We know all this. So within the Arab world, there have been several attempts to create a kind of Arabic secular identity, but it hasn't worked over time so far. There is always a fundamentalist radical pushback at it, whether it's from the Shiite or Sunni part. So that's a very interesting thing. Now, something to note is that there is something about Jews and Arabs that we have in common that's been reflected on actually by the famous Israeli singer Margot. She basically said that Israelis are like they try to live like Americans, but they have an Eastern understanding of honor. In other words, we're kind of a blend. In Israel, we're a bit Western, but we're also Eastern and Middle Eastern. And we feel that very strongly in the streets in Israel. In fact, there's a book called Second Israel, Israel HaShniya, which has a lot to do with Begin and the 1970s revolution. I think it's called the Mahapach. It's called the turnover, where basically the Israeli national right overturned the socialist left. So this is a lot of what's the conversation within Israel is a lot about East versus West. And I'm just mentioning this, again, this is a very broad topic. But when we talk about East versus West in Israeli culture, there is an internal struggle, sort of, which we're trying to resolve, which which has an impact on how we deal with the current geopolitical situation by saying, on the one hand, Israel wants to be a Western country. And on the other hand, it's very Middle Eastern. And so within Israel, you have people who came, let's say, from Eastern Europe and Western Europe, and they're very, very different, and they end up clashing in different ways. So understanding East and West, understanding the Sykes-Picot Agreement, understanding Arabic culture is a lens into understanding what is going on in Israel beyond what you hear in the news. Now, I know this is a very heavy topic, it's a broad topic, so I hope that I treated it well enough from a bird's eye view, giving you food for thought so you can delve more into it. Now, the last two topics I'd like to cover is, first of all, the story of the North. So what's going on in the north of Israel? Now, on the north, this is my brother with the tank, who I mentioned is the deputy mayor of the Golan Heights. So he just sent me these pictures today. So these are pictures from Syria. The Syrian border right now has a strong presence of the IDF. And while we have currently a ceasefire, which has to do more with Lebanon, let's see how it holds. We don't know. Time will tell. But the civilians in the north want the IDF to continue to stay there on the Syrian border to feel safe. So that's probably going to stay for a little bit of a while. And that's what we see here. We see that the army is basically leveling a lot of areas that could be used to infiltrate the Golan Heights, and we're defending the border. Because who knows what's going to happen now with El Julani? Time will tell. Now, but the Golan Heights have been relatively quiet. The part of the north which has been in trouble is the Galilee, so Kiryat Shmona and so on. And in the Galilee, currently many of the inhabitants have evacuated because of the barrages of missiles, and it's just impossible to live there. The Israeli government is saying that the plan is, assuming that the ceasefire holds, the plan is that everybody goes back home by March 1st and everything should be fine. The assessment, this is my brother's assessment, is that about 40% of the people will stay wherever it is that they are. Many of them are in the Golan Heights, many of them are in Herzliya, Netanya, other places in the center. And why is that? Besides the obvious, which is the fear of the rockets falling, the impact on education. The impact on education. Think of the children whose education has been disrupted. We've already had COVID just a few years ago, so you can understand how disruptive that was to education and the impact that had on an entire generation of children. Children who cannot study because they're constantly running to bomb shelters. They had to move to different parts of the country. And for that stability, their parents are just going to wait out till the end of the year. They're not going to go back in March. They're going to wait till July, August to return. But another very interesting thing that's happening is that if you've ever been to Kiryat Shmona, one of the northern cities in Israel, there's nothing to do there. And suddenly you're sitting in Netanya, and there's 3 cinema cities within driving distance, and there's all these things for activities for kids, and you're around civilization. Things are different. Like, you get used to that. Let's stay. So the assessment is that about 40% of the people are going to stay where they are because they like it there, and it's a lot more manageable. We'll see what happens down the line, but currently that's what's happening in the north. So right now, most people are not there. They're evacuated, but hopefully they'll start coming back. And of course, we'll see what happens, but this is the assessment. So the Golan Heights got a tremendous population boost right now, which is really important because the Golan Heights is one of the frontiers of agriculture and small businesses, but it's a very large place. It's hard to get to. I mean, my brother had a baby boy when I was in New York. I still haven't seen him because it's so far away. So time will tell. We'll see what happens. But this has had a good impact on the demographics of the Golan Heights. Okay, so this is the north. I'll just mention that Lebanon is a very interesting story. What's happening in Lebanon right now, and this has a lot to do with the Shi'ite-Sunni balance. When one is up, the other one is down. So we see the weakening of Iran, which is Shia. We see the weakening of Hezbollah, which is Shia, right? So we have a lot of that going on, and in the meanwhile, we have a rise of a government that's very anti-Hezbollah, even though Hezbollah tried to push a lot to get involved and make sure that they have a pro-Hezbollah government. They weren't successful in that. They're weakening, and their popular opinion is also going down the tubes. And the government in Lebanon, we have to remember that it's related also to French colonialism, because the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the very term the Levant, relates to the division, the carving up of the map by Britain and France. The French have a very strong connection to the north, to the Levant, going back to Crusader times, and also during the Ottoman Empire. They were given a lot of power there. They made, there's a university, St. Joseph University in Beirut. I mean, Beirut was the West in the Middle East. So that was a very important point for Western colonial grip in the region. And the French, not the French, the Lebanese government is a very unique kind of government, but this was dictated by the French, which has a combination of Shi'i, Sunni, Christian, Muslim, a certain kind of balance of the different powers that are supposed to be there, which is a very unique kind of government. And of course, that was thrown out of balance because of Hezbollah, which is now in the decline, hopefully. But the army is constantly keeping an eye on what's going on in the north. So certain towns were saying, okay, let's move out of this town and see what happens. Are Hezbollah moving back in, or are they not? So we have the finger on the pulse of what's going on in Lebanon. Okay, deep breath, and final topic. The final topic is the ultra-Orthodox recruitment. In the picture here, this is the recruitment center. It says, welcome to the IDF, Bruchim Habayim L'Tzahal. And there's a lot of ultra-Orthodox who are basically refusing to enlist. Now, what you might hear on the news is that we absolutely need the ultra-Orthodox because we need the manpower, which is correct, and that they can't be moved, they won't budge, and all they want is privileges from the state, funding for their religious institutions, the yeshivot, but they don't really want to participate in the Israeli economy. And they simply look at Israel as perhaps a necessary evil that they need to get as much as they can from without really contributing to. That's generally how the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredi community is looked at. And unfortunately, that is somewhat true, but not entirely true. I would like to show you a picture, which I'm sure you've heard of this, the ultra-Orthodox battalion, formerly known as Nachal Haredi. Nachal is infantry. So they're called the Netzach Yehuda Battalion. They were founded about 24 years ago, 25 years ago. The 97th Battalion, they're related to Kfir. And this is a very important shift. You could even say a tectonic shift, but it's a silent revolution that's happening within the ultra-Orthodox community. The ultra-Orthodox community is very shielded. They very much do not want foreign influence, and they fear that the army, being a secular Zionist organization, basically in service of the state, will conflict with their religious sensitivities. So by and large, there's a resistance to joining the army. But on the other hand, the younger generation is realizing that you have to contribute. They are realizing that the life of just studying Talmud all day is not fulfilling for everyone. Maybe for some people it works, but for a lot of people it does not work. And they quietly go and enlist. Now, if you put them on the spotlight, like many politicians do, you will burn a bridge or you will blow this silent revolution out of the water. And unfortunately, for political gain, many politicians, and this has happened for decades, have made a talking point for their campaigns to force the ultra-Orthodox to enlist. And this is by and large counterproductive. And the reason it's counterproductive is because it's already happening. But if you make them publicly have to choose between their allegiance to their rabbinic leadership and and their community and their family, or joining the army, they will most often than not choose their family. And often, if they're put on the spot, they will be excommunicated sometimes. So they're joining the army at great personal risk. And just to be clear, the Netzach Yehuda battalion played a very important role and still does, both in Gaza and in the northern border. So these are ultra-Orthodox with the long, with the gazebos, with the peot and the whole tzitzit. They have a religious battalion with sensitivities to prayer time and kosher food and separation of men and women. A lot of accommodations that the army is bending over backwards to do for them. There are thousands of them. There's about 1,000 in Netzach Yehuda, and there's more in different parts of the army. Another thing to consider is, while politicians will tell you, we need people to join the army because we are very low on personnel, which is true, the army is paying a very heavy price to enlist the ultra-Orthodox because of the accommodations they have to make. That has a very, very, very important financial impact on the army. So within the army itself, they're saying, listen, I know we need people, but I don't know if I want to deal with this right now because there is so much we have to do for this. Let's have one battalion here, one battalion there. So while in the public, on social media and the news, they'll say we need the ultra-Orthodox to enlist, which is true, but it's a process that's going to take time. We can't just accept thousands and thousands of them because the army won't be able to function. And on the other hand, there are important shifts that are taking place within this community, both in terms of enlisting to the army and in terms of joining the workforce and paying taxes and getting professional degrees. If you put it on the spot, there are some more, let's just say, more extreme within the ultra-Orthodox who will blast them out of the water. But if you just let it be, it's happening already, but it's a process. It's going to take a lot of time, but it's happening, and mostly because the community is unsustainable. They can't continue to rely on taxpayers to fund their institutions. It just doesn't work. So the change is going to happen. It's just happening very, very slowly. I guess to end this all, I'll say, as from a historic perspective, we have processes that are happening, and we sometimes have to look at the big picture to take a step back. The example I just gave of quiet revolutions that are happening within the religious community, or looking at different perspectives on Judaism. What is it supposed to be? What does it mean to be Israeli? So in Israel itself, part of the East and West conflict is in the kibbutz movement, which is a communist or even socialist Jewish movement, the kibbutzim. In the 1960s, there was a split in the kibbutz movement over the ichud and the meuchad, basically saying, is it socialism in service of being Jewish or Judaism in service of being socialist? That was a profound split in the kibbutz movement. So the East and West is very much felt in many different ways in Israeli society. And finally, in terms of the Muslim world, Judaism has gone through its, so to speak, barbaric stage. You read the book of Joshua and you're talking about people that basically remind us of the tribal religious wars of today. We've been there and we've grown out of it. So has the Christian world. The Muslims, from that perspective, are just not there yet. It's a matter of time. They've been trying time and again, pan-Arabism and so on. It hasn't worked yet, but it seems that there is a push in that direction, and the big geopolitical picture that's going on shows us there's a lot of positive movement. And just one final thought about this, in terms of East and West, the fact that we call perhaps the most successful peace accords in Israel, the Abraham Accords, is is because of the understanding of our common roots with Arabs. It's a Middle Eastern issue that we need to solve, as opposed to Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton coming in as Uncle Sam saying, "Hey, we want you to get along. You know, in the Western world, we need to get along. We have democracy, we have nice values, we have pretty things, we have culture." But what about the Eastern sensitivities? The Abraham Accords are called that because of the common root of Judaism and Islam, Abraham, which is saying, let's try to solve it based on our common grounds. That's the Abraham Accords. And we're starting to see historic shifts, and hopefully Saudi Arabia will soon join the Abraham Accords. We're hoping, obviously, we're all hoping that that will happen. But if that happens, it will have a tremendous ripple effect. I mean, when it happens, it will have a tremendous ripple effect on the entire situation in the Middle East, and hopefully we'll have pathways to a better future. So these are some of my reflections and thoughts on the current situation. I hope these were insightful and helpful and not too confusing, and I hope that you find in them also some kind of encouragement. Thank you so much, everybody, and